Adam, I want to explore a little bit with your expertise the connection with basketball to the city of New York. It's something that I think everyone who's a casual basketball fan, you know the history of point guards in New York, for example. You know the connection, and you know when the Knicks do anything exciting over the course of the NBA season, or especially in the playoffs, instant traction for the league, and it's palpable even for someone like myself in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I mean, it's more exciting when the Knicks are exciting in the league. Can you speak to just why that is that basketball has such a deep connection with the city of New York?
Sure. Yeah, basketball's had a deep connection with New York for 100 years. It started, if you look historically at the growth of basketball, it is one of the few American major sports that doesn't require a large footprint. So you don't need a giant diamond or huge field. You don't need a rink or anything to play it. And so it instantly became, a sport that was perfect for places like New York. And in New York, where space is at such a premium, basketball was the one sport, along with stickball or street ball, but that is only baseball insofar as it's a ball and bat sport. Basketball immediately lent itself to that culture. And with the, especially, once you fast forward and look at the 1930s to 1960s, where you see white flight and you see white families moving to suburbs, this becomes a sport for minorities, people of color, Jewish Americans. And so, those populations rise up in New York. And so you have, the first great pro team was the original Celtics in New York City, which was a group of Jewish players, right? So, from almost its inception, basketball in New York City went hand in hand. And what happens is that relationship becomes so important that generations then of kids and their kids and their kids grow up with basketball being an escape, basketball being a way to create community. And so by the time my era rolls around that I study in the 70s, basketball is entrenched as just part of New York culture. It's as entrenched as, as anything in the city at that point. So it's something that doesn't happen overnight, but over the course of 30, 40, 50 years, by the 1960s and 70s, again, it's inseparable from New York City and continues to be in many ways 50 years after that.
Can you talk about that connection and then the rise of hip hop as well? I think they're all fused together even to this day. And I think you see certain pockets of at least the United States and internationally, hip hop and basketball fused together. But New York is just, I don't know, it feels special. I've just never even been to Record Park, but just watching documentaries or seeing specials or, hearing hip hop songs, that resonates to a lot of people, even though they may have never been there before. So can you kind of talk about that relationship?
Yeah, so that was kind of the other pillar on which my book project was built. One was the all-black Knicks of the 1979-80 season. The other was, as I'm doing research, I'm like, what's going on in New York City at the time? It's like, oh, hip-hop is emerging from New York City at the time, and it's not coincidental that there's an all-black team that faces a lot of backlash at the same time that this new culture is developing from the South Bronx. And one of the most immediate connections that I found was that a lot of the early hip hop artists were performing outside in public areas, which were basketball parks. And so if they're happening at the same location, there's going to be overlap. And then you have stories like Beastie Boys basically meeting and, they got together because of basketball, right? They're running pickup games, they start to hang out and then develop from there. And, Run DMC, not the Beastie Boys too, but you have these connections in which basketball and musicians are connected. And really it becomes part of the same culture, is that you have, again, predominantly African Americans, people of color living in these areas in New York City. What do they do for fun? They play basketball, they listen to music, and so those two become connected. And pretty soon, hip hop becomes the sound, the soundtrack of basketball. And one thing that the NBA does that's very smart is in about the mid '80s they embrace it, and so it was overdue. They arguably should have embraced that connection sooner. But beginning in about 84, 85, they begin making sure that All-Star Weekend, for example, becomes a way to feature hip-hop artists and musicians. And to the point that, years later, the All-Star Game is called, the Black Super Bowl, because it is just this fusion of African American culture, musicians, athletes, celebrities, movie stars. And that in part it's helped by the NBA, but that wouldn't have been possible without it being such an inseparable part of New York City culture, beginning in the late 70s and moving forward.
So in looking at the Knicks, obviously being in New York City and coming off of this title win and success in the early 70s, with 2 titles in the early 70s, how did that team transition, and how was the community embracing that team, and what were expectations around that team following that 73 championship?
I think it's really funny. We mentioned a little bit earlier the Knicks getting Karl Anthony Towns. To me, and that may turn out being a fantastic decision, a fantastic move. But as somebody who's followed the Knicks and knows their history pretty well, for 50 years they've been chasing that next superstar. So the teams in the early 70s were so beloved. And, if you haven't read the book by Harvey Ayrton, When the Garden Was Eden, or watched the 30 for 30, New York City loved that team. It was what New York City envisioned itself to be. It was cosmopolitan. It was, I hate to use this term, but they considered themselves colorblind. Black players and white players got along and seemed to hang out. There was every flavor of personality on that team. You had flakes like Bill Bradley, who was kind of the great white hope. You had men like Willis Reed, who'd gone to Grambling and who was like a stand-up, solid character. You had Walt Frazier, who was like the epitome of cool in the early 70s. You just had like this perfect team. And then the problem that the Knicks ran into is that they retired and they really didn't have a way to replace them. So free agency didn't yet exist. When you're drafting last in every draft, you're not going to be able to restock with talented players as easily. And people didn't want to trade with the Knicks. It's the same conundrum you see now among top teams. Danny Ainge got that reputation for you don't want to trade with the Celtics because Ainge is going to rip you off. Red Holzman and company got that reputation. And so the Knicks got bad and then started chasing superstars. So they tried to get arguably 2 of the biggest names in the NBA at the time were Spencer Haywood and Bob McAdoo. They got them both. And even McAdoo's agent said, well, there's only one basketball on this team and that could be a problem. And so that idea of chasing the next superstar became a recurring theme for the Knicks again, arguably it's been 50 years, and Karl Anthony Towns is the next in this line of he's going to be the one to lead us to the promised land. And with the exception of a Jalen Brunson, there just haven't been many swings and hits. They've been a lot of swings and misses in terms of the Knicks trying to land that next piece. And I'm reminded of when LeBron James became a free agent for the first time after Cleveland and ended up in Miami. Everybody assumed he was going to New York, right? Durant becomes a free agent. Everybody assumes he's going to New York. Neither did. And so to me, it's so fascinating to see that over the course of 50 years, it's kind of been same old story for the Knicks in many ways, and trying to chase and capture that feeling, that sense of community, the way that the early 70s Knicks just really brought that city together.
Why do you think the Knicks still resonate even to this day, besides just the big market nature of the team? Because if you talk about the Knicks to maybe a casual fan, you would think the Knicks, have the most championships in the NBA. But yet, their track record. So why do you think they remain so popular despite all the drama, all the failures, and just all the letdowns?
On one hand, they are on the biggest stage, right? But on the other, if you talk, no matter who you talk to, they probably have, if they were a basketball fan, they have some great Knicks memory, right? So if they were around in the early 70s, they of course remember that golden age of Knicks teams. If they were there in the early 80s, they remember Bernard King scoring 50 and, Bernard at the Garden. And if they're older, Patrick Ewing dominated, he was one of the, 2 or 3 most well-known NBA players for 15 years. And if you go to the 2000s, you've got the Carmelo Anthony Knicks, you've got Linsanity. And so you had these moments that just when you thought the Knicks were going to kind of slide off the radar, they managed to kind of hang in there. And every time, again, I mentioned with free agency, every time there's a significant free agent, it's, well, maybe he'll sign with the Knicks. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start hearing Giannis potential to the Knicks moves here soon. Like, it seems like the Knicks have always stayed relevant, even though, and it actually shocked me a couple minutes ago when I said 50 years ago, because it's been now 51 years since the Knicks' last title, which is insane. And like you said, Justin, I think if you ask most casual NBA fans, they would assume that, at least a couple since then, but it's just, they haven't.
It's interesting too. You mentioned the identity of those early 70s title Knicks teams, and anything I think I can speak for at least Justin and I with the Knicks. I think you have this leftover sort of like toughness and grittiness that was imprinted by Pat Riley and the culture that he brought, along with what Patrick Ewing was doing, and a lot to do with the way the league was structured at that time as well. And that's not to say that those early 70s teams weren't tough in their own right, but it sounds like in their heart of heart, I mean, with the Knicks being kind of this big spectacle team, kind of this instant interest team, they really do prefer, as most teams would, to get the big star names on that roster and maybe not go about it the way that they've instances of in small periods here and there. I'd say most successfully, recently, aside from those 90s Knicks, in trying to sort of build this culture around Tom Thibodeau.
Yeah, you're right. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking like, yes, Ewing was the centerpiece of those 90s Knicks teams. But I think if you ask people my age who were whatever, teenagers or in their 20s at the time, their favorite players are probably Oakley, Mason, and Starks, right? They like the tough, scrappy. They like the, Charles Oakley's going to throw somebody down and John Starks is going to punch him in the face. Like, that's the identity that they like. And that's the Pat Riley Knicks teams. And that is absolutely what Thibodeau is trying to recapture in many ways. And so it's that grittiness. And if you talk to, again, talking to Knicks fans, like the players that they like on the team, they love Jalen Brunson, of course, right? But it's the scrappy, it's the guys who are, getting after the loose balls. And I heard a lot of people say that they were missing DiVincenzo more than Randall, because he brought some toughness and grittiness to the team. And even Randall played hard. So those kind of things, it's funny that you mentioned that the 70s teams were tough, but they were not, outside of Willis Reed, they were not that kind of physical, back it up with blood threats or physicality. They were going to beat you with their brains, which is something that no one would have accused the 90s Knicks of doing.
And there's a lot of smoothness to those teams, right? And in how they would score and create.
And the thing that they always, you watch the video or hear them talk about, it's that they were very selfless. They would make the extra pass. And this is something that is very difficult to accomplish in the post free agency period, is that you had a group of guys who played together for 5 years, 6 years, and they were veterans who knew how to play with each other. Just, they, with a glance, they knew, oh, he's going to go back door, and they would throw the backdoor pass, right? Like, they didn't have to call a lot of plays. It was very much kind of a motion offense, but run by 5 players who knew each other very well. And so that the sense of ball movement and people movement, of screening, like, it was a very fluid form of basketball. And I think it's what people point to when they reminisce about, the good old days when people passed and like cut, and they're thinking about the early 70s Knicks, those teams that, again, were marked by their selflessness.
I want to ask you, with the love affair of the fans that they have with the Knicks, do you think that kind of enables over the year their front office kind of not to make the wisest decisions, because they know the fans are always going to be there? Just they always want to root on the Knicks. I mean, again, Matt and I were talking about the Cowboys and just what they're going through. Like, no matter what, Jerry Jones, I mean, he's still going to make his billions of dollars because everybody wants to see the Cowboys, no matter how bad they are. So do you think that love affair is it has some kind of negatives to it in terms of kind of some checks and balances? If the team stinks, like, it's kind of hard to kind of deny still wanting to see them play just because of the magic of the Garden and everything what the team represents?
Yeah. See, I would actually go the other way and say that and here's what I mean by that. I think that ownership and ownership, general managers, whoever, they see loyal fans and they want to reward them. And so they're looking for the quick solution. And again, I don't know, how well this Karl Anthony Towns move is going to go, but I think the idea of we've got a title window open. What can we do to win an NBA title in 2 to 3 years? And I would argue that the Towns move is looking that direction. And I think that oftentimes, again, no matter who knows how this turns out, but is that the management has been short-sighted in the desire to bring a championship today. And instead of a long-term build through drafting and kind of developing players, that they've gone for the quick fix. And I think on one hand they can do that because they know that no matter what, people are going to show up at the Garden because there's the magic of the Garden. But I also think there's a desire to win now that has been the hallmark of the team for 50 years.